Right. Let's see, is this on? Oh yeah, it is. Everyone hear that okay? Good. Wow, welcome everyone. It's been a while since we've been back here in person. It's so nice to see you all. I was telling Dr. Robey earlier, I had absolutely no sense of how many people were coming today. And I am pleased with this number. This is great. We have probably about this many people also logged in on Zoom right now. So thanks for being here on Zoom from wherever you are. This is going to be our new normal, I think, for the foreseeable future. It's going to be our plan to I don't know if simulcast is the right word, to stream these at least here. We'll have you here in person, as many as are willing and able to come. And we're happy to be able to open this up on Zoom as well. Just in case we have any strange AV difficulties, I apologize in advance. We're doing everything we can to make it work. Please do give us feedback. We would love to hear how it goes, especially those of you at home or wherever you may be. Let us know what we can do differently. We have actually recently applied for a grant for a lot of really nice new video equipment. So we'll see if that comes in, and that will improve things even more. I didn't introduce myself. I think probably everybody here, well, just about everyone at least knows me. My name is Jeff. I am the Senior Director for External Affairs here at the Museum of Idaho. It is my privilege to be also count Museum Club among one of my duties here. And it's a lot of fun to be here. I've also joined with a couple of my colleagues. Ashley Perdomo, our Director of Marketing, is running the chat on Zoom and letting you in, or not letting you in, I guess, if she doesn't want to. And then Camille Thomas is here also from the development department, going to make sure that everything looks good on this end. If you haven't met Camille yet, make sure you do so. She's been with us, what, about a month or so?
Yeah, about a month.
So far, just moved here, and we're so happy to have her. So, okay, so for now, just a couple of little housekeeping things. Remember to silence your phones if you haven't done so already. We'll place them on vibrate. We will have a presentation followed by a question and answer session. You are more than welcome to we'll hold the Q&A until the end, but for those of you on Zoom, you're more than welcome to type your questions into the chat whenever they come up, and we will get to them. We'll make sure that we have that interaction with you at the end of the session as well. Let's see, those of you who are Museum Club long-timers may have noticed that we have pared down significantly on our refreshments. That is a COVID era precaution that we hopefully will not have to do forever. We'll bring back more stuff for you later on as an enticement to come in person. I think that's about it for housekeeping and protocol. We have a wonderful upcoming schedule planned out for the next couple of months as well. We have flyers on the back counter there. If you haven't picked one up already, please do so. It is also online on the museum website. We have some good stuff coming up, ranging from natural history to local media to more cultural history and all sorts of good stuff. So we're excited to get going again every first and third Thursday right here. So one more quick announcement, I guess. Hopefully those of you who are here have been to the museum recently and have seen our brand new exhibits, Way Out West and Animal Inside Out. If you haven't yet, please take the time, whether today or another time, to walk through. And we will be resuming our Museum Club tours, exhibit tours in the near future as well. Our behind the scenes tours with our experience team. So you can learn a little bit more, as you deserve to. In addition to our upcoming schedule, we are also going to have our Museum Inside Out fundraiser gala. We haven't had any large events here for a while at the museum, and it's about time to celebrate the fact that we have finished the creation of this exhibit. It's been about 4 years in the making, and have reopened, gingerly at least, And so we're going to have a gala. We call it an inside out gala. It will take place in both inside the museum and out front, depending on your ideas or your comfort level with being around other people. We will have both options available to you. Come in and enjoy a wonderful high-end East Idaho event, and hopefully make some money here for the museum, 501c3 nonprofit. So that is August 20th, and those of you who are interested in purchasing tickets may do so on our website. And as always, members have discounted tickets available to you. So, okay, that's a lot for me. Without further ado, I am honored to introduce Dr. Sarah Robey for you today. Sarah specializes in nuclear history and American cultural history. Her forthcoming book, Atomic Americans, explores civic life in the early years of the atomic age. At Idaho State University, where she is assistant professor, Dr. Robey teaches courses in the history of energy, the history of science and technology, and American history in general. Also, in addition to the new book, she has an article in a forthcoming book on the subject. She is active in Cold War history, nuclear history, etc., in digital media as well, and has even, if I'm not mistaken, received a podcast grant not too long ago from the Stevens Institute of Technology and the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which is the sort of thing that academic faculty didn't do about 15, 20 years ago. So it's cool to see different ways that our thinkers can move their work forward. Dr. Robey has a PhD from Temple University. She is from the Chicago area, and we are happy to have her here to present Atomic Education and Entertainment in the 1950s. So without further ado.
Giving us a little feedback earlier, hopefully. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Deb, and thank you to Ashley and Neil for getting the program up and running. I am honored to be your first kind of hybrid person back. I also want to thank everyone who's joining us today. As I was telling a few folks before we started, this is the first in-person lecture to anybody I have given since March 12th, 2020. And you know, for us educators, we love having kind of the in-person dynamic. But over the past year, we've also learned the value of having virtual audiences as well. So pretty pleased to be able to be here as well today. So as Jeff mentioned, I am a nuclear historian. My expertise lies in the history of nuclear science, nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, nuclear politics and policies, nuclear culture. And at ISU, I consider myself quite lucky to be able to teach in these fields as well. So just over the past year, I've been able to teach the atomic age. I've taught a class on the history of energy a number of times now. So I'm one of those lucky few who gets to teach in the same thing that they research. In my research life, thinking about nuclear history, I have grown particularly fascinated with how regular people came to learn about nuclear science and technology. It's one thing to study the careers of Manhattan Project physicists and the kinds of policymakers who made really important decisions for us over the past 75 years. Those stories are certainly important, but it is another tall order to try to understand what everyday people were experiencing at the dawn of the atomic age. Just as a little bit of inside baseball into what historians do, to ask a question, right, like what everyday people were thinking, a historian's kind of smoking gun source, right, is a personal recollection, right, an interview transcript or a diary or something like that. But as many of you might imagine, those sources are few and far in between. It's really up to whether people thought about writing things down and whether their children and grandchildren thought about keeping that stuff after the fact. So getting into the heads of Americans who lived through these early years of the atomic age is hard. But it's something that I have spent the better part of a decade the most fruitful and interesting approaches that I take to asking this question about everyday people is to use popular media. What popular media allows us to do is not necessarily get inside people's heads, but understand what information everyday people had access to. And that's what we're going to be exploring today. I'll tell you, once you start scratching the surface of the late 1940s, the 50s, 60s, you start to find evidence of atomic culture everywhere. And I don't just mean the kitschy stuff or the radioactive superheroes and atomic martinis. I'm talking about real life people who are weighing very heavy options, thinking about big global events and thinking about their own personal health and safety. But today, I'm going to share just a small segment of that vast landscape of what we call atomic culture. So that small segment is not only, I think, tells us a lot about what was going on in this early period, but I think it's also something that maybe some of you at least have not learned much about or know much about in the first place. Now, a brief caveat, I give this at most of my public lectures. I know that there are some people in the audience who are very well versed in nuclear science and technology. You will notice that throughout the lecture, I use the words atomic and nuclear rather interchangeably. And I often opt for using atomic over nuclear. And while I know that technically speaking, these two words are not synonymous, these are the words and language that the actors I study or the people I study in history, that's what they were using. They were using the term atomic age. They were using the term atomic bomb long after we were talking about not atomic bombs. Anyway, so please give me that, that latitude as I'm presenting today. All right, so I'd like to start with a short clip of the very beginning of a 1953 film titled A is for Atom. And given that we've kind of cobbled together a working system, I'm really hoping the technology bears with us here.
The atomic age was born. There is no denying that since that moment, the shadow of the atom bomb has been across all our lives. All men of goodwill earnestly hope that a realistic control of atomic weapons can and will be achieved. Meanwhile, good sense requires that all of us prepare for any eventuality. But wisdom demands, too, that we take time to understand this force. Because here, in fact, is the answer to a dream as old as man himself, a giant of limitless power at man's command.
All right, so the atomic age is born. As you might have gathered, just from that brief snippet, what this film is about is teaching everyday people about some things about nuclear science and technology. The film goes on, and we'll look at some other parts of this later on, but the film goes on to talk about all of the different wonders that the future of nuclear science and technology might bring to humankind. I like to start with this 40-second clip because it's a really clear illustration of how fraught the early days of the atomic age were. The film acknowledges, right, that there is no doubt the shadow of the atomic bomb, has cast across everything people knew in 1953 about nuclear. The rest of the 15-minute film goes on to present nuclear science as the answer to a dream as old as mankind, a search for endless energy, and what humans might gain from what became known as the peaceful atom. So there's this very intentional shift after this segment.
That for a second.
I can use my teacher voice, that's okay. It allows me to walk around a little bit too. But so there's this very intentional shift from thinking about weapons of war to the peaceful future. This brief vignette at the start of the film represents a contradiction that was baked into nuclear culture and everything surrounding nuclear science and technology from the start. We have to remember that for the vast majority of Americans, the atomic age started on August 6th. And then the second bomb 2 days later in London. Although the use of those bombs surely brought World War II to a close, those earliest days after World War II were marked by both fear as well as relief. Intermission. That's for the. Okay, but I can still speak loudly for these guys. Okay. All right. So after World War II, both fear and relief dominated the public reactions to the end of the war, in large part because of the novelty of these weapons. And this fear continued long after the close of the war. This is a feature story from Life magazine published in November 1945, just a few months after the end of the war, where Life postulates what future wars might look like. The 36-hour war, they write, will be short and brutal and dominated by atomic warfare, as you can see here with some cut and paste images from that article. It's in the same era, this late 1940s era, that the nuclear Cold War was heating up. By 1949, the Soviet Union had their own atomic bomb. By the early 1950s, both nations had much larger, much more destructive thermonuclear weapons. By the end of the 50s, there was the nuclear navy, the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which could deliver weapons faster and over vast distances. And I will point out, Life managed to predict a lot of those developments in 1945. It's kind of a little eerie, but this should go to show you that those sorts of future war developments were certainly on the minds of folks, even though World War II was over. Okay. Needless to say, the public perception of nuclear perils only grew after the close of World War II. But there is a simultaneous current of optimism, nuclear promise, alongside nuclear peril. Certainly for those of us in this part of the world, there was optimism, right? In the 1949 decision to open the National Reactor Testing Station out in the desert, now known as Idaho National Laboratory. This is also from Life in 1949. This was exciting news. Never mind that Life's reporters repeatedly referred to ARCO and its surrounding areas as wastelands primed for development. I'm not sure how people in ARCO felt about that, but nevertheless, right? There is optimism, there's excitement here. There is a village waking up to be ready for the atomic age boom, right? So like this village waking up, there was a pervasive attitude that the atomic age could be that which revolutionized human society. A journalist in 1949 put it pretty optimistically that historians of the distant future may say of this era that it marked the end of the Dark Ages, dismissing most of the earlier achievements of civilization through the past 5 centuries. Now, I don't know if I'm a historian of the distant future quite yet. I remain a little bit skeptical of this claim that we can forget the last 500 years because of the atomic age. However, this certainly should read to you as optimism, right? And revolution. In December 1953, some of these optimistic visions seem to be coming true, okay? This infamous photo, which many of you have doubtless seen, is a string of 4 light bulbs lit up by EBR1, Experimental Breeder 1, out at what's now INL.
As reported in newspapers across the country, with the illumination of 4 light bulbs, EBR-1 heralded the arrival of atomic electricity. Okay. The New York Times called it a new chapter in the atomic age. And pretty soon thereafter, promoters were also predicting that, nuclear electricity would be too cheap to meter, right? You hear that phrase over and over and over in the 1950s. We can talk in the Q&A. There's actually some interesting history about how that was attributed, but anyway, electricity too cheap to bother metering, right? The Atomic Energy Commission, right? The organization that oversaw all of these agencies in nuclear research and development, claimed that by the year 2000, there would be 1,000 nuclear power plants in operation in the United States. For those of you who are not familiar with this industry, since then there have been 134 commercial reactors built and 90 some odd power plants across the country. Not all of those are operational today, right? So that was an optimistic estimate, 1,000 reactors, but nevertheless, there was a lot of excitement. Anyway, promoters, including journalists, policymakers, government officials, scientists, and a whole bunch of other folks, touted these light bulbs lit at EBR-1 as evidence of the manifold future benefits of the peaceful atom. And this would not only include nuclear electricity, but also transportation technologies, industrial benefits, form the basis of new medical procedures and treatments, and other research applications. EBR-1's milestone happened amid a growing wave of what I call public nuclear education, okay? And this was happening in print forms, on the radio, in television broadcasts, which in the late 1940s is just starting to get off the ground. Films, all sorts of different media are starting to kind of dive into this big effort to educate the public about nuclear science and technology. Perhaps some of you might be familiar with this guy. So Bert the Turtle, of course, is the civil defense mascot. He taught generations of Americans to duck and cover. I'm getting a lot of nods out in the audience right now. Right, so this was an instructional campaign designed to teach school children how to take cover and be safe in the event of an atomic attack. But Bert's campaign, alongside other civil defense campaigns and publications, were just one small way that Americans learned about nuclear threats and nuclear possibilities. Another way was public nuclear education that would fall into the category of nuclear edutainment, which is a much easier word to write in my notes than it is to say. I'm sure I will fumble over that today. But the idea is, right, it's entertaining and it's educational, edutainment, nice portmanteau there. Right? All right, so nuclear edutainment was also another significant segment of how everyday Americans learned something about nuclear science and technology. And what's interesting to me is that a lot of the sources that we can look to in this category, nuclear edutainment, were produced by industrial giants such as Monsanto, Union Carbide and Carbon, Westinghouse. There are a whole slew of them that now I'm not remembering. But what we're going to focus on today are a couple of publications by General Electric. Okay, all of these firms produced nuclear edutainment media that had a strikingly wide reach. These weren't just campy science class film strips that some of us may be also familiar with. These were big budget, entertainment spectacles. All of these companies had the clout, the resources, the money, the connections to place their productions at mainstream movie theaters, right? On television and radio in prime time, in print publications that made it into the hands of millions of Americans. So this was a pretty big segment of what we're talking about when we're talking about how everyday people or what everyday people were exposed to in terms of learning about this topic. And if we read a little bit more closely, as we're going to do today, we can start to get more of a feel for what Americans were learning about nuclear science and technology, all the while perhaps even being entertained. Okay. Now, as I've worked with this body of sources, There are a few things that stick out to me. One thing that I think is most noticeable about the whole genre of nuclear edutainment is that these sources really put a lot of effort into helping people visualize the atom, okay? Giving the audience a way to visualize or imagine something that was potentially unfamiliar, potentially scary, and we have to remember, was not even visible by our best scientific instrumentation at this time, right? So for all intents and purposes, invisible. And most Americans in the late 1940s into the 50s had little reason to learn about atomic structure or particle physics, right? This wasn't just something that was common knowledge. In fact, let's remember that the discovery of neutrons was less than 2 decades old at the time we're talking about right now. Okay, so this is new science and it's not common knowledge. So I'd like to show another clip of that 1953 A is for Atom film to give you a sense of how some of these ideas were communicated, what sorts of tools the producers of this media were using to get people's attention and to teach them. And I didn't say this before, but A is for Atom was produced by General Electric.
Switch the mics back.
Okay.
All right, we're picking up where we left off. The giant limited.
And where was it science found that giant? In the atom, a particle so infinitely small that it takes over 100 billion atoms to make up the head of a pin. Just as other millions and quadrillions of atoms are the tiny building blocks which make up everything in the world. Ships, and shoes, and sealing wax, and cabbages and kings. Although no one has ever seen an atom, scientists have learned a great deal about how they behave, and there are widely accepted theories as to what they're like. Let's start by meeting a leading authority on the subject, Dr. Atom. Now, observing the professor himself, you can see that his structure resembles, in many ways, something almost as vast as the atom is small, the solar system. And there are certain similarities. This is the center with electrons in surrounding orbits. But whereas the planet's movement trons is slightly different, there are other differences too. Hey, hold it. Thank you. Now, the solar system together is electrical. The electrons, which are negative, are attracted by the protons, which are positive, and vice versa. But here in the nucleus are other particles with no electrical charge called neutrons. Very important characters too, as we shall see. And equally important when it comes to atomic energy is what scientists call the atom's binding force. It's a kind of cosmic glue holding the nucleus together. This, then, is a single atom, but certainly not all atoms are alike. There are in nature more than 90 basic elements, which is science's term for families of atoms. To scientists, the atoms of the individual atom families, or elements, are identified by number. That is, the number of protons or positive charges in their nucleus. And they vary all the way from hydrogen, which has just 1 proton, to oxygen with 8 protons, to gold, he's rich with 79. Finally, on to the heaviest of all natural elements, uranium with 92 protons. Now, within each element, or family of atoms, there can be different members, each one having the same number of protons, but differing in the number of neutrons. The total of an atom's protons and neutrons is its atomic weight. Thus, in natural uranium, we have U-234, U-235, and U-238. These different members of the same element or atom family, science calls isotopes. Some elements, tin for instance, have a great many isotopes. Others, like aluminum, are lone wolves with just one. Now, most atoms of most elements are content with their lot in life. We speak of them as being stable, but others are busy day and night being what science calls radioactive. Like radium, throwing off powerful rays along with some of its neutrons and protons, until it actually alters its own nuclear structure and changes to another family, and then to another, until it does become stable at last. This spontaneous changing of elements is called natural transmutation. Its discovery gave men of science an idea. If an atom could change itself, why couldn't man change an atom?
Cute, right? I feel like Professor Adam should be my avatar. All right, so as you can see, not yet. As you can see, the film spends a lot of energy trying to get people to be familiar with atomic structure, and not only what makes up an atom, but also how atoms make up the things in our world. Still, it's clear that the film's writers understood that people might still have a lot of trouble visualizing what an atom means, especially the scale. So what we've got up here is another one of these publications, this time a comic book. This was first published in 1948 and then revised several times across the 1950s. So in another one of these publications, you can see them using the pinhead metaphor again. Okay, so if you can't read the text here, basically it's an older guy teaching a young guy about atoms, right? And you talk about how if you took the time to count the number of atoms in a pinhead, right, it would take eons. But you'll also notice that it's got this other nice visual device of thinking about the nucleus of an atom as being the size of a raspberry in the Grand Canyon. Now, that's approximate, but surely, even if you have not been to the Grand Canyon, you have some idea of how vast an area that is and how small a raspberry is in comparison. As all of these sources, the comic book, the film, all of its kind of cousin publications, as all of these sources teach us, you have a basic primer on the particles, the components of an atom, and that usually is used as a segue into explaining nuclear fission, right? The splitting of atoms. So as all of these sources teach us, certain atoms and isotopes, like uranium-235, can be split into pieces, and releasing a great deal of energy. When that split occurs, neutrons are set free. On the left is an inset from the comic book with a pretty typical diagram kind of explaining what happens when you split an atom. You get some chunks of stuff, other elements, and there are some neutrons let go, right? As those neutrons fly into the surrounding material, it has the potential to continue breaking apart other atoms, right? And this is the chain reaction. So in all of these sources, right, the narrator or whoever is guiding us in the comic book take a lot of time to explain fission, right, and the chain reaction that could possibly happen afterwards. Here's another example in the comic book of using match heads to demonstrate how a chain reaction works. So what these guys have done is broken up a bunch of matchsticks and lined them up so that the heads of the matchsticks each then light two more matchsticks, and two more matchsticks, and two more matchsticks. Just like the raspberry in the Grand Canyon, just like the pinhead, suddenly you have a tangible, relatable object to think about these high science concepts. And that is certainly useful. For those of us who don't know much about this science, I think we could probably all agree that having these visual aids is really useful. Most of us have never seen an atom. All right. But along with matches and raspberries, nuclear edutainers also relied on other metaphors and comparisons. This is a couple of stills from the film that we were watching, illustrating how if you filled up Yankee Stadium with dynamite, you would get approximately the same explosive force as a baseball-sized chunk of uranium-235. Okay. Again, approximates, generously approximate here. But again, if you've never been to Yankee Stadium, at least you have an idea of what a baseball looks like and what a big professional baseball stadium looks like. So relying on these visual metaphors is super important, and it's definitely kind of a hallmark of all of this nuclear edutainment. Okay. But the real heart of all of these films and comic books and pamphlets and radio presentations and television broadcasts is the promise of what's possible tomorrow. That is a near utopia of prosperity with health and plenty. These films and other materials tend to sort of sidestep talking about nuclear weapons, or at least they just sort of lie the issue. My guess is that producers sort of just assume that average viewers knew enough about atomic bombs, right? But that they needed to know something else about nuclear science and technology. So instead of focusing on the destructive capacities of nuclear science, the films emphasize the peaceful benefits to the world. But, you want me to switch?
It sounds like the people on Zoom can hear better with this. So sorry.
No, that's all right.
Interrupt.
Okay. This is a good site. This is a good intermission as well. Okay, but this all begs the question of why, right? Why would GE invest so much money in hiring a professional cinematography team, right? Cartoonists, a production staff, a soundtrack, all of this stuff. Not only pay for that, but pay for its distribution, right? To many, many Americans. We're not talking about small change here. In the first 3 years after its release, A is for Adam was seen by about 13 million Americans, mostly in movie theaters, not in classrooms, okay? And although the film is animated, we have to remember that that's not the exclusive domain of children in this era. Most of that 13 million were adults, okay? The film, by the way, won a whole bunch of industry awards, which is kind of interesting. It's one of the reasons I know so much about this film is because it won awards, and I found records talking about the awards and why it won. As I mentioned before too, Westinghouse, Union Carbide, right, Monsanto, all of these companies were producing similar things, right? Most of what I've looked at deals with nuclear science and technology, but also a host of other scientific fields, okay? The other thing we have to realize in terms of thinking about the why question is that none of these films or productions were trying to sell you anything, right? They weren't commercials. And so it seems strange that these big industrial giants would even bother to put these things out into the world. So what was the objective, right? And this question actually brings us to a pretty significant point of contention among nuclear historians. This is the kind of thing that we sit around arguing about with great intensity at conferences and stuff, and I promise we are a delightful bunch of people. But this is the kind of thing that we disagree about. So what I've put together here is kind of a smattering of possibilities, right? Things we know, connecting dots we can connect. And what I'm about to talk about might make you think of other answers to why as well. And so if you've got those, I'd love to talk about it more in the question and answer. Okay, so officially, General Electric would say that these productions were just sort of a public service, right? A public educational campaign and altruistic kind of effort to make a more informed citizenry, right? You know, it should be noted that it's not just nuclear science and technology that you know had these sort of edutainment products, but yeah, this was a rather big chunk of that kind of production in the 40s and 50s. So certainly this kind of idea of a public service is part of the story, but I don't think it's the whole story, okay? For one thing, although A is for Atom, right, the film Adventures Inside the Atom, which was the comic book, and others, although they didn't sell you a consumer product, they certainly did contribute to GE's public image, right? And General Electric made plenty of other consumer products that you might be encouraged to put in your own home, right? So, you know, it's plausible that GE saw an opportunity here just to boost its public image in general by putting this sort of content out into the world, you know, this fun educational media. What the public was much less likely to know, however, is that by the early 1950s, General Electric had several major contracts with the federal government and the Atomic Energy Commission to help build reactors, to develop nuclear industry parts, right? So they were working behind the scenes. And this was an era of pretty heightened nuclear secrecy. So the average person would not really know the details of that if they knew anything at all. So, you know, GE is working with the Atomic Energy Commission. They likely hope to continue profiting off of that for many years to come. Whatever positive public attitudes nuclear edutainment could garner could conceivably help GE stay in the game, right? Especially when they're competing with Westinghouse. Like in the behind the scenes nuclear world, it was Westinghouse and GE all the time fighting. Those records are fun. Anyway, okay. For similar reasons, okay, positive publicity about anything nuclear could help bolster public approval of government initiatives having to do with all nuclear science research and development, including weapons, right? If you put forward the face that the AEC is as invested in the peaceful atom as they are in the arms race, that has public benefit, right? And this too would be a win for a major industrial corporation that worked for the government, right? So you can kind of connect some of these dots too. There's some other ways we can think about this. I bumped ahead on my bullets here, but this era of nuclear edutainment was happening right as the Cold War was heating up, right as competition with the Soviet Union was becoming kind of part of our everyday discussion and actions, right? It's very possible that this sort of material was seen and designed as a recruiting tool, not just for children, but for young adults or even older adults. I don't know, whatever not young adult is, right? You know, by the late 1950s, the federal government had actually passed the National Defense Education Act, which pumped more than $1 billion of 1950s money into science curriculum development for K through 12 schools and higher education. So this was an era where the direct link between education and funding education was seen as a Cold War effort, right? This was the way the United States would win the Cold War. They would triumph in scientific and technological expertise, and we needed people to go into the nuclear industry in order to do so, okay? Frankly, there are a lot of other kind of similar Cold War related reasons that I can think of that are sort of in this milieu, but we can come back to that later if you'd like. But I think there's something less cynical than a lot of the reasons that we've already discussed, okay? Less of an ulterior motive than what we've already discussed. I see nuclear edutainment as part of a strong American faith in the ways that information and knowledge can empower individuals. This faith was especially powerful in American civic life after World War II, and I think it's no surprise that that could be kind of in the mix here as well. In the early days of both the atomic age and the Cold War, nuclear knowledge and better access to information about it likely had the added benefit of calming and reassuring a public that might be afraid of nuclear science, perhaps because the only association they could have made was with what President Eisenhower once called the awful arithmetic of the atom bomb, which, by the way, he said in front of the UN the same year that A is for Atom was released. It's really concurrent ideas here. All right, so in the end, nuclear edutainment like that, which we've looked at today, is just one piece of the puzzle in terms of understanding how the American public adjusted to life in the atomic age. These formative years in the late 1940s and 50s set the tone for much of what was to come in terms of public attitudes about nuclear proliferation, the Cold War conflicts, right? Nuclear war in general. But these early days also set the tone for much longer term public attitudes about nuclear power, especially given that the nuclear power industry was just in its infancy in the mid 1950s and later in that decade. Okay. Over the last few years, as I've talked with more and more people with connections to Idaho National Laboratory, it seems like there's this kind of persistent puzzle of trying to understand why public attitudes are so mixed about nuclear energy, nuclear electricity. Well, they have been for a really long time, right? Since the beginning of the atomic age. And I think that rewinding to this early era helps us better understand the trajectory of the nuclear power industry just a little bit better, and it gives us some insights into the future. Thanks very much.
All right, let's go ahead and open it up to question and answer now. If you have anything here in person, I have questions as always, but I want to let everyone else ask. And then Ashley, as they come in, you can just read them out from on Zoom too.
I'm counting on you to keep track of the time.
Sure thing.
I am watchless. So, what do we want to talk about? The question was, where do I get an atomic pill to run my car? Well, we're not there yet. Yeah, these were Johnny's fanciful ideas about the future of nuclear energy. Yeah.
So I'm curious about, so we talked, unless this happened in the minute that I was out of the room, essentially about the American experience, and I'm wondering if you could draw any comparisons to how other countries did this same education.
Yeah, well, a couple of thoughts there. When we looked at the Soviet Union, which is probably the nuclear story that I know second best to the United States, their media environment was very, very different, especially in the late 40s and in through the early 1950s before Joseph Stalin died. The media environment was very, very controlled. And so they too had kind of what we would consider now campy kind of informational films. That was certainly part of it. Used a really similar rhetoric of competing with the West in nuclear science. And, frankly, the Soviet Union had a very well-funded nuclear research and development sector. But so we have to think about kind of how those sorts of messaging, that sort of messaging would have been produced and distributed. It would have been very different and probably would not at all involve an industrial corporation in the Soviet Union. And then for Western Europe, I think we can safely assume that a lot of people's exposure to nuclear science and technology and information about that was similar to the United States, but like delayed. Part of the initiative in the US to promote the peaceful atom was actually to share nuclear technologies with friendly nations so that they could start a nuclear power industry or other kind of peaceful uses. And so one of the things that the US was engaged in terms of soft diplomacy was sharing nuclear information with other nations. And it would be a pretty safe bet to say that a lot of Western European nations would have had very similar campaigns, educational campaigns. Unfortunately, my language skills are not good enough to think transnationally about this question, but I would safely say it would track against kind of that bigger historical story. Yeah. Lyle. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Corresponding negative information that was coming out simultaneously.
Yeah. So for folks on Zoom, the question was, a lot of this information, this edutainment was very positive. Was there a kind of concurrent negative attitude towards nuclear science and technology? And the answer is absolutely yes. Especially by the later 1950s, you see a pretty significant nuclear dissent movement growing. It's something that I write a lot about in my book. And that was not just in response to the kind of catastrophic imagining of nuclear war, but also the realization that even peaceful uses or peacetime nuclear weapons testing can release fallout into the atmosphere, and you start seeing a whole bunch of organized protests that's concerned about the radiological contamination of the world thanks to nuclear testing. And so you sort of see this blurring of the lines, right? Something I always say is like, atoms for peace and atoms for war, despite everybody's best efforts, are never very easily separated. And so then by the late 1950s, because of fears about fallout and radiological pollution, you start seeing that line getting very, very fuzzy again. People are talking about banning the bomb, but they're also talking about banning nuclear power in the same breath, right? But of course, that messaging was not coming from industrial giants. That messaging was not coming from the Atomic Energy Commission or the federal government. That was coming from organizations like the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, which got its start in 1958, I think. Other big national organizations like that. Yeah.
Did this sort of movie that or first and then the protest so they weren't like anticipating, this wasn't in response to against or how do you think that he was playing that game?
Yeah, so the question is like, there's a chicken and an egg question here about whether this positive PR campaign is in response to something negative or vice versa. Well, there were always critics of nuclear weapons, like from August, well, before the bombs were dropped, but certainly in public, a lot of criticism about atomic weapons, from August 6, 1945 forward. And a lot of people who were sounding the alarm about that, who were saying that nuclear weapons need to be outlawed, that they need to be under the control of the UN and not individual nations. And so I do think that this positive spin, this focus on the peaceful benefits of nuclear science is in response to those sorts of negative attitudes or scary associations with war, with weapons. And that kind of more negative attitude came from a lot of different corners in organized and unorganized ways. Right? Nobody likes nuclear war, right? So yes, you could think about this era as a response, injecting more positive, look over here, think about this. But you could also think about this as, kind of happening at the same time, overlapping with some of these protest movements that are evolving in the late 50s. Big industries that were involved in nuclear R&D continued to put these messages out there for a very long time. We can probably see descendants of this sort of thing in our information culture today too. So yeah, there's this kind of back and forth, I would say, not a clear cause and effect, but certainly these both kind of sides of the argument were present in the public discussion, like forever and still today. Yeah. Please.
There's much risk of nuclear power. Is that involved in where there are signs that these agencies try to hide that? Some of the early problems.
Yeah. Well, so the civilian nuclear power industry was kind of enabled by the Atomic Energy Act revision in 1954. Get the cobwebs out. Which basically relinquished some of the Atomic Energy Commission's control over all things nuclear in order to foster having, public utility run nuclear power plants. And so there was a big push to get that online, right? And so the first nuclear power plant that went online was in Shippingport, Pennsylvania. They used well, the federal government totally subsidized the construction of that. It was a crash program to speed up and do it. The uranium that they were using was like 97% enriched, like way, way, way more than you need for a nuclear power plant reactor. But it was like this PR thing to say, hey, we've done it. And look, it's safe. And look, it's cheap, right? That was another concern, is that nuclear would never be able to compete economically with petroleum and coal, which were cheap in this era. Anyway, so there was certainly a concurrent effort from organizations like GE, from federal government agencies to say, no, it's totally safe. It's totally safe. And look, we're going to get it done and it's going to be amazing. And kind of taking the messages about the peaceful future and like putting that into reality very quickly after this era. Now, there were certainly Americans who were concerned about nuclear power from the get-go, installation of nuclear power plants. There's some really good examples from the late 1950s and early 60s of women's organizations organizing to protest the construction of nuclear power plants in a couple of places in California. Bodega Bay or Bodega Head is the big example here. And the language that they're using to say, no, we don't want this, is very much, we're afraid of fallout. What if something goes wrong? This is a new technology. Not many people knew about SL1 at Idaho, out at the site. But there was public anxiety about power plants going online. And that's how the civilian nuclear power industry got started in this country. Right? It wasn't all daisies and roses. There was a lot of public anxiety, even from the start. It's a good question. Uh-huh. Yeah. No. And one of the reasons why the Idaho site was selected is because it's in the middle of nowhere, right? But it's a place where it's easy to not pay a ton of attention to. And so even though the New York Times picked up the story about the light bulbs, you only see kind of a smattering of reports about SL1 in the 60s. And I haven't looked into it, but I would imagine that the EBR1 incident didn't really register too much on national press. Yeah. No questions on Zoom? Quiet Zoom.
Show the Life magazine, the two pictures,
Mhm.
1945 and 25.
Mhm.
The other one seems to detect multiple ballistic missiles landing.
Yep.
And you kind of commented on it. What that really represented in 1945.
Yeah, it was speculation. It was not representing any current technology, right? We had rockets in 1945, not traveling in orbit like that, No, they didn't predict MIRVs. They didn't. Yeah, but there was, you can find this on the web. Google Books actually has the whole run of Life magazine available for free. So you can actually read the article, but the whole tone of it is, we know what this looks like right now, but we can very easily imagine what it might look like in 10 years. Yeah. I use this article all the time in my writing. So I think it's fascinating. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I mean, we're still there.
Mm-hmm.
So I found that as I think that's
Yeah. Well, and this is a very flattening, kind of simplistic way of thinking about it, but one of the very practical reasons why it's so hard to separate atoms for peace and atoms for war is that, you know, a breeder reactor makes plutonium, right? And so even the very mechanics of reactor development is, you know, in some instances is very much part of the nuclear weapons kind of infrastructure as well. And so it gets tricky. It gets very tricky. Yeah. Please.
I was just thinking that, you know, being in elementary school.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
And I seem to remember. That I had seen pictures of,
Mhm.
thinking, whoa,
Mm.
what is, why are we?
Mhm.
I mean, it just seems sort of.
Yeah. Yep. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I'm actually glad you asked about this because my first love, if that's the right way to put it, in terms of nuclear culture, is thinking about civil defense. So a lot of the book that's coming out next year is dealing with this too. Yeah, you know, my folks are 76 and 77. They too kind of grew up in a moment. My mom was a school teacher, so she also taught people how to duck and cover. It's wild, but yeah, there is certainly for people who grew up with this, there is a very commonly held attitude that, like, yeah, that was baloney. You know, what good would have it done? Which I think is true when you're talking about any time after, say, 1954. So what's important to remember is that Bert the Turtle and Duck and Cover was from an era of atomic weapons, right? Smaller Hiroshima, Nagasaki size atomic bombs. And it's actually not that ridiculous as long as you're not at ground zero, to hide under a desk, right? When there's a pretty big shock wave, and you know, you are at risk of your structure crumbling around you. In fact, some of the California FEMA, no, it's California's version of FEMA, their earthquake protocol is like duck and cover, but just with different words. It's still the same thing. But by the time we're talking about 1953, 54, we're talking about thermonuclear weapons, which were orders of magnitude larger than atomic bombs. And it's at that point that duck and cover gets a little ridiculous. And in fact, the civil defense agencies in the United States, by the time we're talking about the thermonuclear H-bombs, supers, that revolution, they completely turn away from, you know, even blast shelters, right? So duck and cover also kind of came along with the idea you should have a shelter for blast purposes. By the end of the 50s, they are recommending people make fallout shelters, put fallout shelters in their yard, which will do nothing for blast. What they will do is potentially save you from some of the radiological contamination at a distance from ground zero, right? So built into that shift is an assumption that if we're hit, a lot of people are dying, duck and cover won't work. You just have to hope you're in the suburbs, right? that kind of attitude. So yeah, and a lot of that nuclear protest that evolved in the late 50s, part of that was we have no faith in civil defense. Nothing's gonna save us. You know, stop leading us around by our noses, that kind of attitude. So what you're saying is very much a part of how people were feeling at the time, and certainly how people who lived through it remember this. You're not alone at all in that. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 So Joe is saying that folks who live near big cities, including New York City, knew that if the bomb came, yeah, you know, kiss your loved ones, you know, there's not much that can be done. And in fact, a lot of the sources that I look at of this kind of nuclear protest that evolved in the late 50s, people living in New York City, near Washington, D.C., also a lot of other major metropolitan areas were the most vocal critics of civil defense, the most vocal critics of nuclearization writ large, because they understood that they used the language, we're sitting ducks. They understood that their vulnerability was more than somebody who lives in the middle of the continent in a rural state. Although Idaho applied for a lot of civil defense funds, they made a claim, we still deserve to be protected, but.
Right, there are no more questions. I'm sure Dr. Robey will stick around for a few minutes.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much for your time. So happy to have you.
Thank you, guys.